Hello, everyone. If you've ever worked with a large SharePoint list in Power Apps, then you may know that some functions and operations are not delegable, or in other words, will only apply to the first 2,000 items they receive. This can be troublesome if one wants to search and filter for items containing some value, perform some aggregate calculation across the entire list, use lookup columns or related list values in a function, get all the potential distinct values for a column, or perform anything else that cannot be delegated to the SharePoint data source. There have been a number of workarounds for this, like gathering all items to a set of collections on start of the app, manually setting multiple splits on a column to use a delegable starts with search, using API calls to enable searching large lists, getting the Power App to perform numerous calculations and hide gallery items not matching a search, and using Power Automate to filter and search a list to return relevant items to the app, and probably several more. However, most of these have some limitations that prevent full get, filter, and search capabilities on larger lists, like not being fast enough, not enabling a more real time view of data, not enabling further actions with related lists or lookup columns, not enabling both filters and searches at the same time, not being able to search multiple columns or not searching certain column types like multiline text, not being able to return more than 5,000 items, and more. Well, with today's setup, I advance previous methods of delegating operations from Canvas apps to Power Automate and SharePoint calls. I enable filtering, searching, and sorting queries on more than 150,000 items on any number of columns with any column type at a rate of 2,500 to 10,000 items per second. The queries can return tens of thousands of the top query items to the app. The return data can include relational lookup columns for use in other app functions, and in most cases, queries are fast enough to regularly refresh live data on user initiated actions. All right, to get things started, we're going to go to this URL on the Community Apps Samples page of the Power Apps community site. The link will be in the description. We'll go to the main page here, or the main post, and then scroll down to the bottom and download our Excel sample data and our solution package. And then the first thing we'll do is go back to our desktop, open up that Excel, and up on the ribbon here, we're going to go to, I believe it is, yep, table design, and then go to export. And here we need to get the site address from the home page of the SharePoint site where we want to house this list. So if I go here, here's the home page of the site that I want to import this to. So I'll copy that URL and paste it in here. Then I will name it large SP list. Click next. That loads up these data types for each of the columns in the Excel table. And those all look fine for this demo. So I'll hit finish. And that will take some time to load. So in the meantime, we will go over to our Power Apps page. So you may, if you just click on, say, the Power Apps in the ribbon here, it'll bring you to this page. Then you'll need to go to Solutions, and then you can click Import Solution, Browse, and then select the correct package file here. Click Next, and then that all looks good. So we'll click Next again. Make sure that this SharePoint connection is on the account that you want it to be on, and then click Import. And once the solution is imported, then you should now see the option here under display name for large SP list delegation workaround demo. We'll click on that. Just cancel out of these. And one of the first things we'll see in the all resources page is the delegation workaround demo app. So I will go to the three dots here and click on Edit to start loading the app. And once the app loads, then we'll want to go over to this Power Automate tab on the left side over here, then click on Add Flow. And here we can see the two flows that came with the solution. So I'll click the SP list query flow there, and then I'll go back and also click on the SP list query sorts. And those two will load. And then I'll also go to add data over here, type in SharePoint, the connection, and then find the site where I loaded the list. Then I can find the list name right here, select it, go to connect, and that will load the SharePoint connection. And once the SharePoint connection and the flows are loaded, then you can go back to the tree view and click on the app component here. So we'll go up here and change this parameter from start screen to on start, and then expand the formula bar here to see what is going on when the app initially starts. We initially just have some pieces loading user email and username variables, but the main pieces that we want to pay attention to here are these flow variable input defaults, and then the actual flow action here, which takes all the default inputs and then uses it to generate the query that searches, filters, and sorts the SharePoint list and returns that list data into a stringified JSON into a variable here called query result. So if we go up to the variables and their defaults here, what we'll initially look at is this site address piece, which we need to change out with the site address that holds our actual SharePoint list. So I'll copy that homepage site address URL and paste that in here. And then this is already set to large SharePoint list, which is our demo list. Of course, if we actually want to set this up for some other production application data source, then we'd need to include the list name for that production data source here and the site address for that production data source here. But once we have those set up, then we can move on to the next piece here, which sets the default filter and search parameters. Initially, we just have these set to blank because we are loading in the entire list without any filters or searches applied. In a later step of the video, I will show something and better explain how these two pieces work, but we can skip over them for now and move down to the expand columns and select columns piece. So the expand columns includes the piece that helps the query reference any lookup or person columns and their associated field values, the field values associated with that lookup column. So basically, if you have a lookup column in your list with a relationship to another list and you want to use fields from that related list, then you need to include the SharePoint name for the main lookup column, followed by a forward slash and ID for the ID of that lookup column. And including that signifies to the rest of the query that we want to include that lookup column and its potential related fields in the selection of all the columns to return, which leads us to this select columns piece, where this is a comma separated list of all the columns that we want to eventually return to the app. You can see for the lookup columns that we included some pieces here where to select the related columns on that related list, we need to include, again, the main name for that lookup, the main name of the main column for that lookup, followed by a forward slash, and then the actual related field or column in that lookup. So if you're looking at your SharePoint list and you know you have those pieces where it says the name of the main lookup column, and then it has like a colon, and then it would say like title. This is the equivalent of that, where it's saying, okay, for that author lookup, then forward slash and go to and show that field from that lookup. Another thing to mention here, if the column you want to select is extra long or includes any special characters or symbols, then you will need to go to the actual SharePoint list and see I have an example here with this test column. Then you'll need to go to the gear icon on the list, go to list settings, and then in the column options here, find the column in question, click on it to go to the column page, and then click up in the URL, go to the end of the URL, and after this field ID equals, you'll find the backend SharePoint name for that column. So you'll need to copy that and then use that to select the column here in this parameter. And you'll also use the same backend name to reference the column anywhere else in the app. So that's what you need to do for that. I think lastly, for this select columns piece, just note that smaller queries means that it's working with less data. So the query will return the data faster. So make sure to only include the columns that you actually need and not just everything you could possibly put into it for the app. And that'll help get your users their data a little bit faster. After that, we have the sort inputs. These control the default order the columns will be presented in any component like a gallery. By default, this orders items by ID descending. So it returns the most recently created items first. But both here and in later pieces, we can change this to sort on any desired column in any order, even on related or nested columns from lookup fields. So if we want to set up an example of sorting on a nested or related lookup field, then what we would do is we would take the main column name for that lookup field and include it as the first sort column name variable. And then we'd take whatever we want, whichever nested related field from that lookup, and use that in the sort column name to variable. And that would then sort all of our items returned to the app by the authors or the created by email descending. But I'll revert that back to ID descending. And that explains that piece. So next we have the max return count. So this max return count controls the top count of items to actually return to the app after all filters, searches, and sorts have been applied. So if you had a list of 100,000 items, you likely wouldn't want to slow the performance of your app by working over that number of items in memory. You would only want to return the top items relevant to the user and work on those. The query flow will still apply filters, searches, and sorts on a much larger portion of your list. So your users can access pieces of that larger portion at any time with the query parameters that they input in the searches or filter options. But it does not all need to be held in the app itself. So this is kind of delegating much of the actual work and calculations to Power Automate instead of having the app do everything. After that, we have the read batch size, which controls the read size or top count for some SharePoint actions in the flow. Lower read batch sizes here may make for faster queries on smaller data sets of less than, say, 100,000 items, but they'll make the flow use more API calls in a user's daily action limit on their license. So on larger data sets, I really suggest just setting this to the maximum read batch size of 5,000. After that, we have the max item check. So this variable controls how many of the most recently created items our filters and searches should apply to and return data from. By default, this will check every list item up to the 150th thousand most recent item. If you have a larger list of, say, 300,000 that you must filter and search over every item, then you can increase this to 300,000 or more. But much higher numbers here can start to slow down any queries without any filters or searches applied to them. So if you're okay only checking over the most recent 100,000 or maybe 200,000 items for your users, then that may get them their data much faster. Or you could set the number much higher, but set any initial large queries of the entire list to apply a filter or search. For example, it could filter to only the items where the created by user email equals the current user's email address. And again, if you're working on these much larger lists, then use the max 5,000 read batch size for better results. And that leads down to our actual flow query here, which uses all those default inputs and uses that to generate the query that then searches, filters, and sorts all the data and returns it to the query result variable that we can then use in later parts of our application to display the data. After that, we can also see an optional piece here to set any drop down and column option sets where, for example, here we're building the option sets for the list of countries based on a distinct query of our query result, um, returning just the distinct countries out of our data set. Okay, now that we've gone through all that, then we can go over here and see how this works when we actually initially load the app and run the on start. We'll see that it loads all 20,000 items in a matter of seconds. There's all 20,000 items. We can confirm that going to our list here, going to list settings, and we see 20,000 items there. And in fact, if we go back out to our solution and go to the query flow details, we can see the exact duration of the flow. We see that it took 7 seconds for the flow to run and bring in all those 20,000 items. And this will only get faster as we start to add more filters and more searches here. So before we get to filtering and searching, let's review the main gallery we have here. So we see for items, we are using both the ParseJSON and table functions on the stringified JSON returned from the flow so that we can format that data in a way the gallery can use it. And in this app, it's actually forming a table with a single value column, and every row of that value column contains the item or record JSON object that we can then reference. So that's why if I go and check one of these columns here, you'll see that we're using this item dot value, then dot title with the actual column name there. And if we go to a person column, like created by, we again see that we're referencing the dot value, but then we're also adding in the reference to the main lookup column again before referencing that lookup list additional field, related field to that lookup column. In this case, the title field of the author lookup contains the display name for the created by column. Then I've also set something up here to help resort the data after it's pulled from the query. So each of the columns listed for this gallery has this piece included. And this runs a flow which takes in the current query results and the new values for the sort variables, and then returns the newly sorted data back to the query results variable so that it's resorted on the gallery that's using that query result variable. So that will just say resort, say title to title descending or title ascending, status, country, food type, any of these, including the nested sort that I talked about earlier, where this will take in, say, the main lookup column name and then the actual related field to that lookup so that it can perform that nested or related sort on nested or related columns. And then also, if we go over to the country filter options here, we'll see that we have that country options set that we created. So if I go in here, we have a distinct list of all the available country values. That comes from what we showed earlier here, where it pulls in that list of all the values of all the items and then creates that distinct list of just the country values. And we can do that for any other fields that you want to create that type of filter for. But just for the demo here, I've also included this after and before dates range so that you can filter based on the created date, based on which dates fall in between this after and before setting here, and then status. So you can choose which statuses to show in the gallery here, and then also the search box here to provide a search term that is used in a contains or in type search across all columns of a given record. So let's look at how the app actually uses these inputs to create new flow queries and return new data to the app. And we'll do that by checking on the search and filter button here. So each time the filter and sort button is pressed, it dynamically generates this OData filter string variable and search text variable. And these will feed into the new flow run, which contains the previous defaults for all the expanded and selected columns and max return, read batch, max item checks. It'll just include the new filter search and then any new sorting that you've done on the list or that you've adjusted in the logic here. So going a little deeper into this OData filter string, what it will ultimately come out looking like is this, where it will have the columns, the operator, and then a value between two single quotes, and all strung together with these and statements. So if I'm going back to the app here, and I want to change these out to filter on something different, some other column, then I'd need to include the column name here, the equals to, not equals to, less than, greater or equal to, less or equal to type of operator here in between. And then make sure not to miss this piece. It has the single quote, and then it would have the dynamic reference to whatever input that you've included on the filter section, and then another single quote and the and statement to combine it with any follow on query strings. And note how for each of these lines, we are checking to see if the value is left empty, because if it is, then we just don't want to include it at all in the filter string. And that's why we have this piece here, because we can't just set this last one to say not include and, because we don't actually know if it's going to be the last line. This could actually turn out to be a blank one and country could be the last line. So I've just added this piece in here, which removes whatever the last trailing and statement is. Then the search text is a little more straightforward. It just takes whatever input in the search boxes and passes it on to the flow as the search text. And we can go back over to the query flow and enter the edit menu so I can show where these inputs are actually used in the flow. So if I go into this scope, go into this condition, and then go to this apply to each get items, This is the SharePoint get items HTTP, which uses the filter query string that's generated right here, um, right in between the initial filter that I'm using to sort through each of these, or to go through each of these batches based on the IDs, and right before the select statement and expand statements are used. And then the search text is a little easier to follow here, where this is just going to take the entire item, um, each entire item from the initial HTTP call here, and go through each item's all their values and all their column names, searching for that search term that was sent to the flow, and then only returning the items that include that search term. Of course, if you want to narrow this down to only search across specific column values, then you could include this type of expression here, on the left hand side of this filter array condition, and then it would only search for whatever column names you include in this expression here. So that's the basic pieces that you may need to know for the filter and search. Um, Next, I think I'll just check on this refresh piece here. So you'll see this uses the same query as the filter and search. It just takes whatever the current query variables are and reruns the query flow to reload the data. So let's start using everything I just explained. And I'll start by entering a search term. In this case, I'll just use SAU. And we can see it takes just a few seconds to search across multiple columns for that query. It successfully searched the country, the food, and this multi-line text column. And in the multi-line text column, it has even identified items where SAU came up in the middle of the string. It's not just doing a starts with or ends with. And on top of that, I can add in some of the filters, like the before and after, add in a country filter and a status filter, and try again. And when I use that even more specific search and filter, then it returns everything in 1 to 2 seconds, and I can refresh. And again, it runs the entire query in 1 to 2 seconds. So this is a full filters functionality combined with a full contained search on any number of columns of any column type, and all fast enough for real-time refreshing. So that's all good for querying and viewing items, but if you want to include the ability to edit items, I'm sure you'll be interested in the following piece that I've included here. So I've set the on select of my title column to navigate to this additional details screen that I have. So if I click into there, then it brings me to this standard form setup with a direct connection using the standard SharePoint connection in the Power App. And if I go to the form items here, we can see I'm using the item ID from the selected item in the main gallery to filter that standard SharePoint connection. So note here, if you want to use this for editing, you'll want to make sure that you include the ID column in the select columns variable for that gallery that you'll be selecting on. And other than that, this works the same as any other standard SharePoint editing form, where I can enter an edit, and then I can click a submit button to submit that edit to SharePoint. But before I do that, just want to go and point out this piece here, where you can set the on success property of the form to refresh the query. each time that someone submits an edit, and then the piece that navigates back to the main gallery. This way, any edits that you make will appear in real time back on the gallery for the user. So if I go back here, click submit, then we can now see that edit in real time on the main gallery. All right, that's the setup for the demo app. I encourage anyone who made it this far to follow the link in the description to the community thread and downloads page so you can try it out for yourself. If you like this content, please subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.